A quiet morning turns into chaos. It was a peaceful Tuesday morning at Peterson's Auto Repair, a small, well-kept shop tucked away on the edge of Maplewood. The kind of place where the steady hum of engines being fixed and the occasional sound of tools clinking together created a familiar rhythm that echoed through the small town. Mike Peterson, the shop's owner, moved gracefully between workbenches and lifts, performing his duties with the ease of someone who had spent years perfecting his craft. At 32, Mike was the epitome of quiet confidence. He wasn't just any mechanic. He was known as the best in town, trusted by everyone from the elderly Mrs. Thompson to the local businesses. People came from miles away for his expertise, and they always left with a smile on their face. He had inherited the garage from his late father. But it wasn't just the business that Mike had inherited. His quiet nature, dedication, and sense of justice were all part of the legacy he carried forward. What most people didn't know, though, was that Mike was also the mayor's son, a detail that often went unnoticed in their small town. Mike preferred to stay under the radar, letting his skills and work speak for themselves rather than flaunting his family connections. His life was a delicate balance, keeping the reputation of Peterson's Auto Repair intact while also maintaining a sense of anonymity in a town that pried a little too much. The sun filtered through the large windows of the garage, casting long shadows on the polished concrete floor. The early morning light glinted off the polished chrome tools hanging on the walls. Mike was working on the engine of an old sedan when Sarah, the front desk manager, called from the counter. "Mike, don't forget the Jenkins truck is coming in at 10. Something about the transmission acting up again," she reminded him, her voice a bit muffled by the hum of the engine. Mike nodded without missing a beat, carefully adjusting the timing belt in Mrs. Thompson's old car. "Thanks, Sarah. I'll get Mrs. Thompson's car up first, then take care of the truck." He always had a quiet way of handling his work, focused entirely on the task at hand. There was no rush, no stress, just an unshakable rhythm that had been perfected over years. Mike knew his shop like the back of his hand, and he took pride in it. Peterson's Auto Repair wasn't just a place to get your car fixed. It was a staple in the community. People came here for the peace of mind that their car would be in good hands. Mike had just finished adjusting the belt when a low rumble broke the calm of the morning. The sound of powerful engines revving reached Mike's ears, and his brow furrowed slightly. It was a sound that didn't belong to the small town he'd grown up in. It was the unmistakable growl of motorcycles, loud, powerful, and ominous. Before he could think much of it, the roar of engines got louder. 3 heavy motorcycles rolled into the parking lot, their chrome gleaming in the morning sun. The riders were clad in dark leathers, their faces hidden behind dark helmets, and their tattoos covered every inch of skin visible from their sleeves and necks. Mike knew this wasn't the usual Saturday afternoon ride through town. These were men who were looking for trouble. The garage fell silent. Sarah, who was handling the register, glanced nervously toward the window. The sound of the bike's engines drowned out everything else, and the uneasy feeling in the air grew thicker. "Who are they?" Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with concern. Mike didn't respond immediately. Instead, he kept working, his hand steady, even as the presence of the bikers seemed to loom larger in the air. He didn't show it, but a part of him was already sizing up the situation. Mike wasn't just a mechanic. In his quieter years, he had trained in martial arts under the guidance of his father, who had been a decorated police officer before retiring to serve as mayor. Mike's calm demeanor wasn't just because of his skills with a wrench. It was also the result of years of self-discipline and training that had taught him to stay in control of every situation, no matter how difficult. One of the bikers dismounted first, a hulking figure with a beard and tattoos that covered both arms. His boots thudded heavily against the concrete as he made his way to the front door, flanked by 2 others who followed closely behind. Mike glanced at Sarah. "Stay inside, Sarah. Call the police if you think you need to." With a nod, she quickly retreated into the back office, out of sight. Mike wiped his hands on a rag and stood up slowly, walking over to the front door with a deliberate calmness. His eyes never left the menacing group as they approached the garage, their boots scraping against the ground with every step. They weren't here for repairs. Mike could feel it in his bones. The first biker reached the door and swung it open with a deliberate crash. His voice was gruff, full of an arrogant edge that seemed to echo in the otherwise quiet town. "Hey, you. The mechanic here," he called out, looking around the shop with a sneer. Mike didn't flinch. He didn't need to make a grand show of his presence. "I'm Mike Peterson. What can I help you with?" he asked, his tone calm but firm. His voice carried no fear, just a quiet confidence that let the bikers know that Mike wasn't a man to be intimidated. The biker who had spoken stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. "You're the guy who runs this place. The one who thinks he's got everything figured out." His voice was laced with condescension, and Mike could feel the hostility radiating from the group. Mike's expression remained unchanged. "I run this shop, yeah. But what's the problem? If you need something fixed, we can talk about it." The biker smirked. "Nah, we don't need anything fixed. We just came by to have a little fun. You see, around here, people like you are used to keeping their heads down. But I think you need to understand what happens when you stand in our way." For a split second, Mike's calm demeanor wavered as he processed the words. These men weren't here for a job. They were looking for a confrontation. They were trying to provoke him. It wasn't the first time Mike had been tested in this way, but he knew better than to react impulsively. "Is this about the shop?" Mike asked quietly, his eyes scanning the bikers with precision. "Or is this personal?" "Oh, it's personal. All right," the biker growled, stepping even closer. His two companions flanked him, narrowing the distance between them and Mike. Mike took a step back, carefully moving towards the center of the room, out of their immediate reach. "I think it's best you turn around and leave," Mike said calmly. "You're not going to find what you're looking for here." The lead biker grinned, revealing yellowed teeth. "Oh, we'll see about that." He stepped forward, and Mike knew the next moments would be critical. But what the bikers didn't know was that they had picked the wrong mechanic to mess with. They had no idea that behind Mike's quiet confidence lay a force to be reckoned with. And before they could make their move, Mike was already preparing to show them exactly what it meant to underestimate him. This wasn't just about the shop. It was about standing up for what was right. And Mike was ready for whatever came next. The calm before the storm. The three bikers stepped closer, their boots echoing against the concrete floor of the garage, each one casting a long shadow that seemed to stretch across the room. Mike Peterson stood motionless, his gaze never wavering from the lead biker, who now stood only a few feet away. The tension in the air was palpable, but Mike kept his posture relaxed, his stance steady. His hands hung loosely by his sides, but his mind was already calculating, assessing every detail. The lead biker, who appeared to be the ringleader of the group, cracked his knuckles again, a move that would have intimidated most men. But Mike wasn't most men. He wasn't a stranger to tense situations. Years of training, both in the mechanic's shop and under his father's tutelage, had taught him how to maintain control, even when the world around him seemed to be spiraling out of control. "Look, we don't have all day," the biker growled, his voice low and threatening. "You're gonna pay for all the problems your kind has caused around here. We've been hearing about you. The golden boy of Maplewood, always keeping your nose clean, pretending to be the perfect citizen. You're just another puppet in a town full of puppets." Mike's expression didn't change. He had learned long ago not to react to empty threats. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to stir up trouble by taunting him, but it was clear these men weren't going to back down easily. The biker's words didn't faze him. They were just noise. Noise that Mike had heard 1,000 times in various forms. "So let me get this straight," Mike said slowly, his voice measured and deliberate. "You've come all the way out here to my shop to stir up trouble because I've been too good in this town, because I've earned people's trust by doing my job well." The lead biker snarled. "You think you're better than us. You think your little shop is above us. Well, we're gonna make sure you remember who's really in charge around here. Mike stood his ground. He didn't need to engage in this kind of back and forth. It wasn't about pride or ego. It was about something far more important. This wasn't the time for a fight over pride. It was about protecting the community he loved and ensuring that this garage remained a safe place for people like Mrs. Thompson and all the other regulars who trusted him. "I don't need to prove anything to you," Mike replied, his voice calm but firm. "If you're looking for a fight, you've come to the wrong place. I don't fight unless it's necessary." The two other bikers, who had been standing silently behind the leader, exchanged looks, and the tension in the room grew thicker. One of them, a larger man with a neck tattoo that snaked down his chest, took a step forward, his hands clenched into fists. "That's the problem with guys like you." The second biker sneered. "You think you can talk your way out of anything. You think you're better than us. But you're not. You're just another soft little mechanic in a small town, trying to play it safe." Mike didn't flinch. He could feel the heat rising in the garage, but he remained focused. He had seen too much in his life to be intimidated by bravado. He had grown up in a family that had seen its fair share of challenges. His father, a respected officer who had served the community with distinction, had taught him that true strength came from patience and control. And while Mike's father may have left law enforcement, the lessons he imparted were still very much a part of him. "Take a step back," Mike said, his voice low but commanding. "I'm not looking for trouble, but if you want it, I'll give it to you. But you're not going to find satisfaction here. You're just going to waste your time." The ringleader grinned, clearly unimpressed. "I think we're gonna have some fun after all." At that moment, Mike saw the glint of steel, a glint that only confirmed his growing suspicions. The largest biker, the one with the neck tattoo, had slipped a blade from his jacket pocket and was now holding it loosely at his side. Mike's calm expression didn't falter, but his mind raced as he quickly assessed the situation. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to intimidate him, and he had dealt with bullies before, but there was something different about these men. Their body language wasn't just hostile, it was predatory. They weren't just looking to make a point, they were looking to dominate, to break Mike's spirit. They were trying to break him. But Mike had learned from his father that there was always a way to turn the tables. You never allowed someone to take away your power. Never. "What's it gonna be?" The ringleader spat, clearly expecting a response, a reaction. "Are you gonna be the good little mechanic and let us do whatever we want?" Mike stepped forward just slightly, his eyes locking onto the ringleader's with a calm intensity. "You've made a mistake," he said quietly. "This shop, these people, this town, this is my responsibility. And I won't let you walk all over it. So I suggest you leave now." For a moment, there was a stillness in the room, the sound of nothing but the faint hum of the overhead lights. The bikers looked at each other, unsure of how to proceed. It was clear that Mike wasn't afraid. In fact, his unwavering calmness had started to unsettle them. The lead biker shifted, his jaw tightening as he realized that Mike wasn't going to be an easy target. He took a step back, his hand twitching slightly as though he were considering the consequences. But then, something in his demeanor shifted, a flicker of doubt, a hesitation, just for a second. That second was all Mike needed. Before the biker could react, Mike moved. It was swift, too swift for any of them to anticipate. The second biker, who had stepped forward to join in the confrontation, suddenly found himself face to face with the mechanic. Mike didn't waste time with words. He used his years of martial arts training, his body fluidly responding to the threat with precision and control. A well-placed move sent the biker stumbling back, his knife falling to the ground with a sharp clatter. The room froze. For a brief moment, the bikers were caught off guard, unsure of what had just happened. Mike didn't give them a chance to recover. He was already stepping forward, moving with the grace of a trained fighter, his hands poised and ready. The bikers were no longer in control of the situation. They had underestimated him, And now they were learning what it meant to challenge someone who wasn't just a mechanic, but someone who had dedicated his life to mastering his body, his craft, and his sense of justice. As Mike looked at the men, he spoke again, his voice low but filled with a quiet strength. "I'm giving you one last chance," he said, his eyes scanning each of them. "Leave now, and we'll forget this ever happened. But stay, and I'll make sure you regret it." The room hung in tense silence as the bikers, realizing they had picked the wrong person to mess with, exchanged uncertain glances. The calmness in Mike's eyes was no longer a sign of weakness. It was a warning. The storm was coming, and the bikers had just unknowingly unleashed it, a test of will. The garage was silent, the only sound the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and the deep, slow breaths of Mike Peterson. The three bikers stood still, their previous bravado evaporating in the face of his unexpected and swift response. For a few heartbeats, everything seemed frozen in time. Mike's stance unyielding, his eyes cold but unwavering, the bikers unsure of how to move forward. The second biker, the one with the neck tattoo, gingerly reached for the knife that had slipped from his grasp. His fingers hovered over it, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might bend down and reclaim it. But Mike's unblinking gaze stopped him in his tracks. The moment of hesitation stretched, filling the room with an air of tension that was almost unbearable. The ringleader, who had been watching Mike with a mixture of contempt and caution, was the first to break the silence. He took a deep breath, as if trying to muster the nerve to challenge Mike once more, but there was something in Mike's eyes that made him rethink his position. The quiet confidence, the utter lack of fear, was unsettling. For the first time in his life, the biker realized that he might have met someone who was not afraid to stand up to him, not just with words, but with actions. "You really think you can scare us off, don't you?" The lead biker finally growled, trying to reclaim some of the bravado that had made him so bold earlier. But even his voice wavered slightly as he spoke, betraying the doubt that had begun to creep in. Mike didn't flinch. "I don't need to scare you. I'm just asking you to leave. You don't belong here, and you don't want to make this a bigger mess than it already is." The words were simple, but there was power in them, power that seemed to seep into the room and wrap around the bikers like an invisible force. Mike wasn't just standing his ground. He wasn't just defending his shop. He was standing for something bigger, something the bikers clearly didn't understand yet. The second biker, still recovering from Mike's swift maneuver, took a step back, his eyes darting nervously between his two companions. He was the biggest of the three, with thick arms that could probably crush a man's skull, but the look on his face told a different story. He wasn't as sure of himself as he had been moments ago. "I think we should go," the second biker muttered, his voice surprisingly subdued. But the ringleader wasn't so easily deterred. He shot a sharp glare at his companion, as if trying to will him into action. "We're not going anywhere," he spat, his tone hardening. "You don't get to tell us what to do." Mike's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of concern crossing his mind. The situation wasn't over yet. These men weren't backing down easily, and it seemed like the lead biker was hell-bent on proving a point. But Mike was prepared for whatever came next. He had been trained for moments like this. He had been through enough to know that in a fight, especially one with people like these, you had to stay one step ahead at all times. As if on cue, the third biker, the smallest of the three, stepped forward. He had been eerily quiet so far, staying in the background, his eyes shifting from Mike to the others. His face was covered with a bandana, and he didn't speak a word as he moved toward the workbench, where Mike's toolbox sat. His hands were steady, and the look in his eyes was cold, calculating. Mike saw the movement from the corner of his eye and instinctively reached for the wrench on the counter, his fingers brushing against the cool metal. He didn't want to fight if it wasn't necessary, but he wasn't about to let anyone lay hands on him or his property without a fight. The third biker's movements were deliberate, as if testing the waters, seeing how far he could push Mike before he reacted. "I'm not going to ask you again," Mike said, his voice low but firm, locking eyes with the third biker. "Leave. Now." The biker paused, his hand hovering just above the wrench. A tense silence filled the room as both men stared each other down, their breaths steady but loud in the otherwise still shop. It was a standoff, a battle of wills, and in this moment, Mike was beginning to realize something. This wasn't just about a fight or a challenge. This was about respect, about showing these men that they couldn't just roll into town and threaten the people who lived here. It wasn't just his shop on the line, it was the entire community. The third biker slowly lowered his hand, taking a step back. His eyes remained fixed on Mike for a few seconds, as if weighing the situation in his mind. And then, without a word, he nodded to the ringleader. It was the first sign of retreat, a small but telling gesture that indicated the bikers might finally be realizing they weren't going to win this encounter. But the ringleader wasn't ready to concede yet. His pride, his anger, and his frustration had been building for too long, and he wasn't about to back down to someone like Mike Peterson. He sneered at Mike, his eyes flashing with defiance. "You think you've won? Think you're the big man in this town?" He spat on the floor between them. "You're nothing." Mike didn't respond to the insult. He had long since learned that words like these were just the last-ditch effort of someone who had already lost the fight. But the ringleader wasn't finished yet. With a sudden movement, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small object, something shiny and metallic. Mike's eyes immediately locked on it, recognizing it for what it was: a gun. The air seemed to freeze. For a moment, everything stood still. The tension in the room skyrocketed as the bikers' intentions became clear. This wasn't just a test of physical strength anymore. It was escalating into something far more dangerous. Mike's pulse quickened, but his movements remained slow and controlled. The gun in the ringleader's hand wasn't the real danger. It was the decision he made next that would determine how the situation played out. The ringleader raised the gun, pointing it in Mike's direction. But Mike didn't flinch. He had no intention of running, no intention of backing down. He had been taught to face danger with a calm mind, to trust in his abilities when things got heated. "You want to make it worse?" Mike asked, his voice steady, despite the gun now pointed directly at him. "Go ahead, but know this, you won't get away with it." There was a long pause as the ringleader held the gun in the air. His hands were trembling slightly, the reality of what he was doing sinking in. His companions, once so eager for a confrontation, stood frozen in place, unsure of how to proceed. Mike took a step forward, his eyes still locked on the ringleader. "You don't want this fight. Not with me. Not with anyone here." For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The gun hung in the air, the tension so thick it could be cut with a knife. The ringleader's chest heaved with each breath, and Mike knew that any wrong move could push things over the edge. But Mike wasn't about to give him that satisfaction. With a sharp, decisive movement, Mike lunged forward, his hand catching the wrist of the ringleader in a lightning-fast grip. The bikers were taken by surprise as Mike twisted the man's arm, forcing the gun to drop to the ground with a loud clatter. Before the ringleader could react, Mike's other hand was already moving, disarming him completely. The bikers froze, their eyes wide with disbelief. Mike's calm demeanor, his control, had shattered the tension in an instant. They had picked the wrong fight. And now it was clear. The storm had arrived. The turning point. The ringleader's face twisted with rage as he realized what had just happened. In a blur of motion, Mike Peterson had disarmed him. And now he stood with his arm pinned behind his back, unable to move. The gun, once an imposing symbol of power, lay useless on the floor. The three bikers were speechless, momentarily stunned by Mike's quick and calculated response. The garage, which had only moments ago been filled with tense threats and posturing, now held an eerie stillness. Mike stood in control, his posture unwavering. His eyes, still calm, scanned each of the men one by one, as if reading their very souls. "Pick it up," Mike said quietly, nodding toward the gun now lying on the floor. The ringleader's eyes flickered toward the gun, then back to Mike. The challenge hung in the air like a dare, and for a moment, no one moved. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, their bravado slowly dissipating. Mike didn't need to say much. His actions had already spoken louder than words could ever manage. "You want it back?" Mike asked again, his voice calm but firm. "Then come take it." But the lead biker didn't move. His hand still pressed against his back in an attempt to ease the pain from Mike's expertly executed hold, but the fight had left him. For the first time since they'd rolled into the garage, the bikers were no longer the ones in control. Mike Peterson had flipped the power dynamic entirely. The second biker, the one who had been closest to Mike during the confrontation, stepped forward slowly. His face was red, a mixture of anger and humiliation playing out across his features. "This isn't over, Peterson," he spat, his voice thick with frustration. "You might have won this round, but we'll be back." Mike's gaze hardened, but he said nothing. He knew this wasn't about pride or saving face anymore. The bikers hadn't come for a fair fight. They had come to provoke, to create fear. But Mike wouldn't allow that. He wouldn't let these men ruin what he had built here in Maplewood. Not without a fight, not without ensuring that everyone saw what true strength and justice looked like. "It doesn't have to go any further," Mike said, his voice carrying a quiet authority. "You've already lost. You can leave now, and this will be the last time we cross paths. But if you don't, if you think you can push me any further, you'll learn why this shop isn't just a business. It's a cornerstone of this community." The words hung in the air. There was a weight to them, a warning that was impossible to ignore. Mike wasn't bluffing. He wasn't a man who made idle threats. The bikers knew it, and the reality of what they were up against began to settle in. The larger biker, still holding his arm where Mike had twisted it earlier, finally took a step back, his anger giving way to confusion. "What kind of man are you?" he muttered, almost to himself, his voice tinged with disbelief. "You really think you can stand up to us like this?" "I'm the kind of man who stands up for what's right," Mike said, his voice steady but unwavering. "And I'll always do what it takes to protect this town, this shop, and the people who trust me." There was a long, pregnant pause as the bikers processed Mike's words. The second biker, who had been the most vocal of the group, finally seemed to collapse in on himself, the fight leaving his posture. He exhaled a long breath, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of their failure had crushed him. For the first time, the bikers were no longer a threat. They were just men, standing in a garage, with nothing left to prove. The ringleader, his arms still pinned behind his back, looked between his companions, then back at Mike. The arrogance that had once defined him was gone, replaced by something almost resembling shame. He didn't want to back down. It was in his nature to resist. But he had miscalculated. He had underestimated the mechanic, the son of the mayor, the quiet man who turned out to be far more than just a simple tradesman. Mike took a step back, releasing the ringleader from his hold. The man stood there for a long moment, uncertain of what to do next. The shop, once a bustling haven of mechanics and repairs, was now filled with a palpable silence. Mike could feel the weight of the situation settling into his bones, but he remained as calm as ever. He hadn't lost control. In fact, he had never been more in control in his life. "Leave," Mike said again, his voice softening. "This doesn't have to escalate further. But if you push it, if you come back, I won't hesitate to do what I must." The bikers hesitated, glancing at each other in silent conversation. The realization was sinking in that they had reached a point of no return. Mike had proven his strength, both physical and mental, and their bluff had failed. Finally, the ringleader spoke, his voice heavy with reluctance. "We're not done with you, Peterson. You haven't seen the last of us." Mike didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. He watched as the three men turned and started toward the door, their steps lower now, their shoulders slumped in defeat. The garage door creaked open with a low hum as they exited, leaving behind the heavy weight of their failed confrontation. For a moment, Mike stood still, watching them go, ensuring that they didn't turn back. Only when the rumble of their motorcycles began to fade into the distance did Mike let out the breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His heart still raced from the adrenaline, but he knew the danger wasn't fully gone. They would be back, but Mike was ready for them. Sarah, who had remained hidden in the back office throughout the confrontation, finally emerged, her face pale but relieved. "Mike, are they really gone?" Mike gave her a small, reassuring smile. "For now, but I wouldn't be surprised if they come back eventually. This isn't over yet." She nodded, her voice quiet. "What do we do next?" Mike's eyes hardened, the weight of responsibility settling back onto his shoulders. "We prepare. And we stand strong. This is our town, Sarah. And no one's going to take it from us." The sound of the garage door closing echoed through the room, signaling the end of the confrontation. For now. But Mike knew this wasn't just about protecting his shop. It was about showing his town what it meant to fight for what was right, to stand up against injustice, and to defend those who needed it most. And he wasn't going to stop until he'd ensured that everyone knew what true strength really looked like. The storm had passed for now, but Mike knew that true strength wasn't just about surviving the storm. It was about being ready for whatever came next, and he would be ready. The calm before the storm. The days following the bikers' abrupt departure were quiet, eerily so. The small town of Maplewood had always been peaceful, a place where everyone knew each other, and troubles rarely stirred the waters. But the confrontation at Peterson's auto repair had left a mark. Whispers spread quickly, and the story of the mechanic who stood up to the bikers began to spread like wildfire. Mike Peterson didn't mind the attention. In fact, he preferred the quiet life he built for himself, a life spent under the hood of cars, making sure every engine ran smoothly, fixing what was broken, and keeping the town's trust intact. But the bikers had shattered that peace, and now, with the tension still hanging in the air, Mike knew that it was only a matter of time before they would return, perhaps with reinforcements, perhaps with a plan to truly test his resolve. The mornings at Peterson's auto repair had become quieter too. Customers still came in for their routine maintenance and repairs, but Mike couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Sarah, the front desk manager, noticed it too. She had been with Mike for years, and even though she had seen him face countless challenges with a calm resolve, she could see the subtle shifts in his demeanor. The man who had once been completely unflappable now had an edge of caution about him. "Mike," Sarah said one afternoon as he finished wiping down the workbench, Are you okay? You seem a little different since the bikers left." Mike paused, his hand still on the rag, his eyes distant as if caught in a memory. He didn't speak immediately, but when he did, his voice was steady, though tinged with something Sarah had rarely heard from him, a hint of unease. "I'm fine, Sarah," he said softly, "just keeping my guard up. They'll be back. I'm sure of it." Sarah frowned, her gaze sharp as she looked at him. "You don't think? I mean, they didn't seem like the type to back down. You've got to be prepared, Mike. We both know how these things go. If they come back, we need to be ready." Mike nodded, his jaw tightening. "I know, but it's not just about being ready for a fight. It's about making sure they understand that what they're doing isn't just disrespecting me. It's disrespecting this entire town. This shop isn't just mine. It's a part of what makes this place special." The truth of his words hit Sarah like a ton of bricks. It wasn't just about Mike Peterson and his garage anymore. It was about the fabric of the community that Mike had built around him. The trust and respect he had earned over years of hard work. The bikers had come to tear that down, to test the limits of what Mike would stand for. But Mike wasn't just a mechanic. He was a protector. And if they came back, he would show them just how much this town meant to him. That night, Mike couldn't shake the feeling of restlessness. He sat at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee cold in front of him as he stared at the worn photograph of his father, the man who had taught him everything he knew about responsibility, about standing up for others, about the quiet strength that came from within. His father had been a respected police officer and later the town's mayor, a man who had built a reputation not through authority, but through action. Mike had followed in his footsteps, quietly and without fanfare. But now, standing at the precipice of something far bigger than a simple confrontation, Mike realized that this was no longer about following in his father's shadow. It was about carving his own path, about doing what was right, regardless of the consequences. The garage bell jingled, interrupting his thoughts. Mike stood up immediately, his heart beating faster as the door opened. Sarah stepped inside, her eyes wide with urgency. "Mike," she said quickly, almost breathless. "There's a car outside. I think it's them." Mike's body tensed. He didn't need to ask who they were. He had known this moment was coming. He moved quickly to the front of the shop, wiping his hands on a rag as he approached the window. A sleek black truck sat in front of the garage, its engine idling softly. 3 familiar figures stepped out, their leather jackets gleaming under the streetlights. They had returned. And this time, they weren't alone. The second biker, the one with the neck tattoo, was joined by 2 others, each carrying a sense of purpose, an unmistakable air of danger. Mike didn't flinch. He knew what was coming. Without a word, he turned and walked toward the door, his movements calm, controlled. Sarah, who had been watching anxiously from behind the counter, approached him. "Mike, are you sure you want to go out there? This could get ugly," she said, her voice low but filled with concern. Mike gave her a reassuring look. "It won't get ugly, Sarah. Not unless they want it to." He stepped outside, the cool night air biting at his skin. The streetlights above cast long shadows across the pavement as the bikers made their way toward him. There was no aggression in their walk, no bravado this time, just cold determination. The lead biker, the one who had taunted Mike the most, stopped just short of the garage door. His eyes were steely, focused. "You think you can humiliate us like that and get away with it?" He sneered. "We've been waiting for this moment. You don't know who you're dealing with." Mike's gaze didn't waver. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with, and I've told you once before, you don't want to make this a bigger problem than it already is." The biker's lip curled into a sneer, but this time, there was something different in his eyes. There was no arrogance, no challenge. It was as if the events of the past few days had humbled him, stripped him of the bravado he had carried with him before. But that didn't mean he was done. "You're a fool, Peterson," the biker spat. "You think this is just about a shop, about a fight. No, it's bigger than that. You've taken something from us, and we don't forget easily." Mike took a step forward, his voice firm but calm. "I haven't taken anything from you. You came here looking for trouble, and I didn't back down. But this isn't just about me or you. It's about what's right, and I'm not backing down from that." For a moment, the biker said nothing. He looked at Mike as if trying to gauge him, to determine whether or not he could push him further. And then he sighed, a deep, almost resigned sigh. "We're not here for a fight, Peterson. At least, not the kind you think." He paused, his face unreadable. "We came to give you a warning. You're messing with the wrong people. This town, it's in our hands now. If you don't back down, you won't just be fighting us. You'll be fighting a lot more than that." Mike didn't flinch. "Then bring it," he said simply. The biker's eyes flickered with something, a mix of disbelief and respect. He took a deep breath, turned to his companions, and nodded. Slowly, they began to walk back to their truck, their boots making no sound against the pavement. Mike stood his ground, watching them leave without a word, his heart still steady, his thoughts sharp. As the truck roared to life and disappeared into the night, Mike couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. This wasn't just about standing up to a gang of bikers. This was about something bigger. This was about a town that had never been tested, a community that had never been asked to fight for what it believed in. And Mike Peterson wasn't about to let anyone destroy that. The fight was far from over, but Mike was ready for whatever came next. The storm was coming, and this time, he would be the one to lead it. The final stand. The days that followed the encounter outside Peterson's auto repair were filled with a heavy silence. Mike could feel the weight of the bikers' warning still hanging in the air, like a storm cloud waiting to burst. They hadn't returned immediately, but Mike knew it wasn't over. He could feel the eyes of the town on him, too. Some filled with admiration for his bravery, others with fear for what was coming next. But Mike remained resolute. He wouldn't let fear dictate his actions. The garage continued to hum with its usual rhythm, with customers filing in and out, the sounds of engines being tuned and fixed filling the space. But beneath it all, there was an undercurrent of tension. Sarah, who had always been the glue that held things together at the shop, noticed the way Mike's eyes would linger on the door each time it opened, as if he was bracing for something. And though she tried to keep things light, she knew the truth. They were all waiting for the inevitable return of the bikers. One afternoon, as Mike was finishing up with a car in the back of the shop, Sarah's voice called out from the front. There was urgency in her tone, but also an edge of fear. "Mike, you need to come out here, quick." Mike's heart raced as he wiped his hands on his rag and rushed toward the front of the shop. The sight that greeted him as he stepped outside was both expected and unsettling. A crowd had gathered. Not just the usual small-town faces, but people who had heard the rumors, people who knew something big was about to happen. And standing at the center of it all were the bikers, the same 3 men, but this time they weren't alone. Behind them, an entire gang had arrived, their motorcycles lining the street in a show of force. There were at least a dozen of them now, and they weren't just here to talk. Mike's eyes swept over the scene, taking in the gravity of the situation. These men had made their point before, but now they were here to make sure that point was understood. The lead biker stepped forward, his expression cold and determined. The tension was thick in the air, the kind that made it hard to breathe. Mike didn't step back. His feet were firmly planted on the ground, his gaze locked with the ringleaders, his heart steady. "You didn't listen, Peterson," the lead biker said, his voice carrying across the crowd. "You thought you could stand up to us. You thought you could protect this little shop, this little town. But it's bigger than that. You don't get to decide who runs things around here." Mike's jaw tightened, but he didn't react. He wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of seeing him flinch. He knew exactly what they were trying to do. They were attempting to provoke him, to break him. But Mike had learned long ago that strength wasn't about reacting to every challenge thrown your way. Strength came from standing firm, from showing the world that you couldn't be swayed by fear. "You've made your threats," Mike said calmly, his voice rising just enough for everyone to hear. "But you're wrong about one thing. This town isn't yours to control. It belongs to the people who live here, to the people who work hard every day to make this a place worth calling home." The bikers laughed, a collective rumble that filled the space between them. But Mike didn't back down. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, could sense the weight of their expectations. He had already shown them what he was capable of once, but this time, it wasn't just about him. This was about everyone who had ever trusted him. This was a stand for the town, for everything it represented. "You don't get it, do you?" the lead biker said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're just a small-town mechanic. You're nothing. You've got a nice little shop, a few loyal customers, but you don't have what it takes to take on a group like ours. We've been running things for years. This town's gonna fall in line, whether you like it or not." Mike took a deep breath, the words ringing in his ears. It was tempting to give in to anger, to let the hatred and arrogance of the bikers fuel his next move. But that wasn't what this was about. Mike had been trained to be more than just a fighter. He had learned the power of patience, the strength of purpose. "Maybe you're right," Mike said, his voice level, his eyes never leaving the lead biker. "Maybe I'm just a mechanic, but that doesn't mean I won't stand up for what's right. It doesn't mean I won't fight for this town, for these people." The bikers, who had been so confident in their numbers, looked at each other. There was a moment of hesitation, a crack in their collective armor. Mike could see it in their eyes. They had come expecting an easy victory, but what they hadn't counted on was the quiet strength that stood before them. Suddenly, the sound of a car door slamming shut broke through the standoff. Mike turned his head just in time to see a familiar figure stepping out from a nearby truck. It was the mayor, the father Mike had looked up to his entire life. The older man's presence on the scene wasn't just a comfort, it was a message. Behind the mayor, a small group of local residents emerged from their cars, people who had watched the confrontation unfold from their windows or parked nearby. The mayor didn't speak immediately. Instead, he simply stood beside Mike, his expression hard and determined, and surveyed the bikers with a look that made it clear he wasn't backing down either. The bikers noticed the shift. The support wasn't just from Mike anymore. It was from the entire town. The mayor, the townspeople, the very heart of Maplewood had rallied together. And for the first time since their arrival, the bikers seemed unsure. The lead biker's confidence faltered. He took a step back, as if calculating the situation anew. He hadn't expected this kind of unity. He hadn't expected Mike to have the full support of the town, to have something worth fighting for that was bigger than any of them. "We don't want to fight," the mayor finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of his position. "But make no mistake, if you push us, we'll stand together. This town doesn't belong to you." For a long, drawn-out moment, the bikers stood silent, their eyes scanning the scene, feeling the weight of the mayor's words, of Mike's calm strength, of the quiet power of the community standing behind them. And then something unexpected happened. The lead biker, his face still hard, nodded slowly. The other bikers, unsure but reluctant, followed suit. "You won," the lead biker spat. "But don't think this is over. We'll be watching." With that, the group of bikers turned, their boots thudding against the ground as they made their way back to their motorcycles. The roar of the engines filled the air once again. But this time, it was not the sound of victory. It was the sound of retreat. Mike didn't relax immediately. He kept his eyes on the retreating bikers, his heart pounding in his chest, the adrenaline still surging through him. He had won this battle, but the war wasn't over. He knew that. As the bikers drove off into the distance, Mike turned to face the town. The mayor clapped him on the shoulder, a proud smile on his face. "You did well, son," the mayor said simply. Mike nodded, his eyes scanning the faces of the residents who had come to support him. He wasn't just a mechanic. He was a part of something bigger, something that could never be torn down by threats or intimidation. Together, Mike said softly, "We can protect what matters." And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the town, Mike knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, Maplewood would always stand strong, united in the face of adversity. The storm had passed, but the strength of the town had only grown. And Mike would always be there, ready to protect it.